Welcome to our Virtuoso Leadership webinar, which is the first in our new Kelley Alumni Centennial webinar series, which is brought to you in partnership by the Kelley School of Business Alumni Association and the Kelley School of Business Executive Education Program. I'm Allison DeWitt, Director of Alumni Engagement here at Kelley, and we are so excited to be able to bring you this new webinar series in Kelley Centennial Year, which is also Indiana University's bicentennial year. This year, we're offering a lot of great new programs and experiences for alumni that hopefully you have seen some messages about. If you haven't, please feel free to send us a chat and let us know, and we're happy to tell you more about some of those programs, like our upcoming centennial birthday celebrations and our new volunteer opportunities for you to work with students here at Kelley. We're also very grateful for the opportunity to continue to work with partners around here at Kelley, like the Kelley School of Business Executive Education Program, and our friend Kim Goad, who you'll hear from a little later today in the presentation. I have a couple of quick housekeeping things before we get started. The first thing, if you haven't done so already, please be sure to mute your phones, computer screens, any audio that might be happening, just to help us keep things going today smoothly without any disturbance. We will be taking questions today in the webinar. If you could send those to us via the chat function, we'll make sure to collect all of those, and then Carolyn will spend some time at the end of the webinar going through all of those questions. So, speaking of Carolyn, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our outstanding faculty presenter for this webinar, Dr. Carolyn Gerner, who is the Aldi Incorporated Distinguished I-Corps Clinical Professor here at the Kelley School of Business, IU Bloomington. She has been at the Kelley School of Business for 20 years and currently teaches I-Corps in the undergrad program and negotiation to our MBAs. Carolyn is extremely well respected and highly regarded among many of our alumni, students, faculty, and we're very excited that she is here to partner with us today. And we'll get started here in just a few seconds with Carolyn Gerner.
Hi, welcome, and thanks for being with us today. Well, I've got a question for you. When I say virtuoso, who do you think of? Maybe Yo-Yo Ma on the cello? Tiger Woods for golf? If you're a Packers fan like me, Aaron Rodgers on the football field? All of those are true. And one of the things I'm always intrigued by as someone who's studied leadership now for more than 30 years is how much we can learn from people outside what we might think of as the core disciplines of management. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what we can learn from virtuosos. That term comes from music and now in the modern parlance from sports. And so I'd like to see what those folks can teach us about being better leaders. Let's start with a definition, shall we? If I go to Webster, I see there are two ways to define a virtuoso. The first is someone who excels in technique. In other words, they are technically the best at whatever it is they're trying to do or trying to master. But I like the second definition, or the second level here as well. Someone who is an experimenter or an investigator, especially in the arts and the sciences. So if you're going to explore virtuoso leadership, we have to look not just at what you should know how to do now and what kinds of technical skills you should develop. We also need to look at the ways in which you might make yourself a little more curious, how you might think about experimenting or investigating to find new ways to bring new skills to your leadership portfolio. So that's the definition that is going to guide us as we talk through the virtuoso leadership concept today. You may have heard the old joke. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. And that's true. The people who play music at this highly rated venue are people who have spent years mastering their craft. And the people who play in Madison Square Garden, fairly close to Carnegie Hall, are actually folks who have also spent years mastering their craft. So how do you get there? And what kind of practice is it that you should be doing if you really want to become a virtuoso? Well, first of all, think back into the ways that you've seen musicians warm up for a concert. Have you ever noticed that you'll hear some very tricky passages played over and over and over again? Think of a flute player who keeps playing the same tricky passage 5 or 6 times before he or she sits down and the performance actually begins. That's what we mean by repetition. If we can get something so ingrained in the way that we work that it becomes part of our muscle memory, it's a lot easier to call up the response that we want to have the performance that we're looking for. Some of you may remember an IU basketball player by the name of Kirk Haston. He was for a long time lauded as perhaps the best purest shooter we've ever had on the floor here at IU. Well, that didn't necessarily come to him just through raw talent. For years, all before that he was here, I used to walk around the top of our athletic facility and be able to look down on the basketball courts. And do you know what I saw almost every day? After basketball practice was formally over at Assembly Hall, Kirk Haston came over to the gym where I worked out and shot three-pointers for an hour. He was there way longer than I was walking, I can tell you that for sure. I saw him practice turnaround jumpers 50, 60 times in a row. It was really inspiring to watch, but it was also kind of amazing over the course of the time I watched him to see how much better and more consistent he became. So what we're looking for practice is this idea of really thinking about the things that are most important to your game and then doing them so much that they become second nature. So that's the repetition and the muscle memory piece of what we're trying to ask you to do. The other thing that both athletes and musicians do is basically over-prepare for what it is that they need. I will over-prepare for my fitness, for example, so that I know I won't have to run for the entire period of time the basketball game is happening, but I want to be able to do that should it matter. The fitness piece says, I really want to be physically, spiritually, emotionally ready. And so I don't just practice the specifics of my game, but I think about my overall fitness as well. So take care of yourself. Get some sleep. One of my favorite management studies from the last 5 or 6 years is one where the subordinates could actually predict how much sleep their manager had gotten the night before based on how they were treated during the following workday. So you may think that second cup of coffee has made a difference, but in reality, it hasn't really had the effect you wanted. So what we want to have you do is really think about how you can bring your best self to the forefront. That means you have to make some time for it, obviously, so that you can then really come and read and understand yourself and your business a little bit better. Finally, it's the mental imagery. Can you see the vision? Can you see where you want your team to go? Can you see what it would be? We know so much now about the concept of if I can see myself performing well, I am more likely to do so. And that is something that you can bring into the leadership realm as well. Well, now that you know how to practice, the question is, what should you practice? So I'm going to start with the 3 skills that they tell us managers most often do not have a full grasp on. And then we'll talk about the other things that you might want to bring to the table that are more personal to you. The first is dialogue. There's a really interesting phenomenon that happens when people become leaders or managers, and that is that they underestimate the role that their status plays in the conversations that they have with people. So you may think that you're just throwing out a suggestion for where to go to lunch when you're talking with your subordinates. They will see it as something the boss said. And so suddenly they think they have to have that Cobb salad at the place across the street because that's what their boss recommended. You see, that difference in status is something we lose sight of when we're on the upper end of it because we don't see people as lower than us. What we forget is that people often see us as more up on a pedestal because of the formal position that we hold. So your job in dialogue is to recognize very carefully the things that you're saying so that they really are suggestions rather than you just kind of throwing out an offhanded comment. Most leaders underestimate the chilling effect that they have on dialogue. So you need to work hard to make sure that people feel comfortable talking and sharing with you just as much as you feel comfortable talking with them. Be careful of your tone as well. Another of my favorite studies is when we send managers out and we say, how do you think you communicate with your subordinates? And they say, overwhelmingly, oh, I'm very collaborative. We have all kinds of great back and forth conversations. And then we send researchers to follow them around with clipboards. and we see what they're actually doing when they're talking to their subordinates. And guess what? They do a lot more what we call forcing, or really telling people what to do. They may think that they're being collaborative. Their intention may be to be collaborative. But unfortunately, what's happening is that they're actually being more directive than they thought. So dialogue is one of the things that leaders have to practice. Second is feedback, giving and receiving it. Now, we give feedback in regular ways. We tend to think, oh, I just said you're doing a great job and that's enough. Here's a little secret about feedback, though. The more specific it is, the more we remember it. Ironically, that's one of the reasons that we tend to remember negative feedback more than positive feedback, because negative feedback tends to be a little bit more specific. I did a training session last week, and when the results came back in, I had some folks who said, oh, that was great, you did great. And then I had another person who said, you bounced too much. You were bouncing up and down on the balls of your feet. Well, guess which comment rang most true to me when I was getting that feedback from the participants, right? It's the bouncing. Why? Because I can't really do much about, hey, great, loved ya, thank you. I can do a lot about not bouncing on the balls of my feet, which I do when I get excited about the topic, as those of you who had me in class know. So the idea that I need to be able to give feedback that is specific, particularly when it's good, is one where a lot of managers fall flat. It's not enough just to say, I really think you do good work. Tell them exactly what you liked. Is it technical skill? Is it the way that the information was presented? The more specific you can be with your feedback, the better people are going to respond to it and the more memorable it will be for them. Similarly, you need to be willing to accept feedback and accept it for what it is. If you think that you're going to please 100% of the people that you're working with, I've got bad news. That's not really going to happen. There's always going to be someone who, despite your best intentions, does not feel that what you're doing is meeting their needs or is what they would expect from someone in your position. It just happens. So your job is to be able to say, what can I learn from this feedback? If I can learn from it, great. Let's move on. If I can't, if it's just someone who's disgruntled, well, I want to respect their position, but I also want to see that there's not a lot in here that I can learn from in terms of continuing and moving forward. So feedback isn't just something that you want to seek out for yourself. Be real specific about what it is you're giving to other people. The third thing that a lot of leaders have trouble with is delegation. And I'm really sympathetic to this one. Let me explain why. You usually get promoted to a leadership position because you're really good technically at what you do. So you're a phenomenal accountant, or you are an IT expert that can make a system sit up and sing. So we say, great, you're really good technically. We're going to pull you completely out of your comfort zone and make you a leader where you don't use any of those technical skills anymore. It happens in a variety of organizations. That's how people get promoted. What winds up happening, though, is that those folks find it really difficult to get out of that comfort zone of doing the technical work. And so a lot of them have real issues with delegation. Somebody else won't do it the way they did it. Somebody else won't follow the same procedures, or they won't take it as seriously or as carefully as you did it when you were the one being considered for promotion because you did it so well. So one of the things you want to think about is that your job now is to develop your team, not to develop your own technical skills. You've made a transition. You're developing leadership skills at this point, and your technical skills are things that you want to at least keep fresh, but that's not your focus at this point. At least most of the time when you move into a leadership realm, you're going to have to rely on other people to do what it is that you were previously doing. Some people make that transition really well, but in sports, there's this phenomenon of player coach that doesn't always work out as well as it might. Wayne Gretzky was one of the finest athletes ever to play hockey, and still one of my personal heroes and personal favorites. But as a coach, middle of the pack at best, And in fact, he really didn't do a very good job explaining to his players, especially early in his coaching career, what he wanted them to do and where he wanted them to go. So the whole notion that I need to stop thinking about this as something I'm doing and start thinking about it as something I'm directing is a real tough transition for a lot of folks. So delegation is something that you really need to carefully practice. Finally, there are other things that I'm confident for you are going to be difficult. Maybe it's a high-level review of concepts as opposed to going in and really digging in and proofreading something carefully. Or maybe it's speaking up in a meeting, or maybe it's making presentations to clients. Whatever that is, your job is to practice it until it becomes routine. You see, when we work on weaknesses until we're comfortable with the situation, that reduces not only our anxiety, but it actually increases our performance. So you need to think about what, as a leader, you really want to practice, and then make it a point to seek that out. If it's giving people feedback, seek out opportunities to do that. If it's evaluating performance, do it more often. If you dread that annual salary negotiation or salary discussion with your employees, have them more often. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but the more comfort you have, the less you'll be shaken when those things occur. Finally, I want to caution you not to get too carried away with this whole idea of thinking long-term for the future. Yes, you need a big vision. Yes, you do need to know where you want your team strategically to go. But we talk a lot about vision without realizing that it's truly the day-to-day steps that take us there. So a line from basketball that I really believe to be, I think, really applicable for leaders as well, is you win by executing the next best play, not by obsessing on winning. So think about it as a series of steps, a process by which you will get your team from one thing to the next. So the second part of the definition that we said we would talk about is this idea of experimentation and investigation. And there's a couple of things that I'll leave you with at the beginning of this process. The first is that good leaders are fanatical about improvement. Not necessarily about benchmarking themselves against competitors, although obviously that's important for success too, but just doing things slightly better than they did the previous time around. So if you can think about really making improvements every time you do something, it'll actually wind up getting you a better insight into what you're trying to do. I often say I can't teach the same class twice, because every time I go into the classroom, I come out with a list of things that I'm going to do differently next time that'll make it what I think is even better. And that's where that improvement process kicks in. Don't get satisfied, don't get complacent, but really try to say, hey, I'm pretty good right now, but I can get better. The other concept that you might want to adopt from business and actually from some sports teams as well is this idea of failing fast. And the concept, if you're not familiar with it, basically says when we have an idea, we're going to start testing it more quickly than not. And we're trying to look for flaws in the prototype so that we don't spend a whole lot of time wasting our resources on something that ultimately isn't going to pan out. So when we get something that turns out to be a failure as an idea, that's actually a win. Our notion is to say, all right, we know that that's not going to work. We can put that aside and move on. You see this with people developing playbooks for those sports that need to coordinate teams all the time. We'll try this play, and if it doesn't work, we're just not going to try it again. But that's exactly what needs to happen for you as a manager. This technique isn't going to work? Well, tell your people, I tried, and then we'll move on and see if we can't try something else that we discover together. This is going to be a really interesting transition for a lot of folks because it involves you having to think about failure in a new way. The cultures that get this right and the companies that really adopt this learning orientation are the places where it's okay to make a mistake. And so as a manager, you really need to set the tone for it is all right to try something and have it not work out. If someone comes to you with bad news and says that your new product didn't make it through an initial focus group, your job is to say thank you and we learned something, as opposed to becoming upset about that. So it requires us to really adopt a mindset of learning and looking for what it's going to take to learn to move forward from whatever happens. I am a huge fan of our Indiana University women's basketball teams. And those of you who are watching our girls this year know that they are just a special group of women who are doing some really cool stuff. They're nationally ranked. They started out the season by taking out a couple of national title contenders. Just really fabulous. Oh, and quick shout out, Allie Patberg and Brenna Wise are both Kellys. Just saying. But the idea that every loss is a learning experience is one that Coach Morin really takes seriously when she's working with that team. And she says when we have something that doesn't go as planned, we are learning what else can happen. So when our leading scorer isn't doing what she usually does on the floor, let's see who else can step up and who else can get into position to make some really good shots. This has turned out to be a team with a lot of depth and a lot of versatility. And that's, I think, the beautiful thing. They try a lot of stuff, and then they, from their losses, learn and move forward with what's actually working well. The other thing to think about in terms of basketball is that context matters. There really is a methodology here to putting together the best team. One of the cases we teach here at IU talks about the Army crew team, the people who row boats competitively for Army. And it's a classic story where the coach of Army said, I'm going to get my best rowers, my individually fastest rowers, and put them all in a boat together. And that became his varsity squad. Unfortunately, the JV squad, which was, of course, all the kids who didn't row well enough to make it into the varsity boat, well, they routinely beat the varsity squad in practice. And the question of why this team could beat these folks who were pound for pound better athletes and better rowers is really the big takeaway from this case. It says, I don't need the best individuals, I need the best team. Or as we say in basketball, seek your best five, not your five best. So the idea of looking to put yourself in a context where you know people can be their best and you know they can work together productively is really important. A couple of other things you can take for that. Be aware of what your teammates do. And if you can assist them, do it. And then finally, if it's not your shot, pass the ball. Give somebody else on your team the opportunity to shine. There are a lot of folks who learn pretty easily that even though they're a really good shot, they're not always going to be the one in the best position to score a basket. As Michael Jordan was famously told, Michael, you don't pass, you won't play. So now that we've talked about some of the tangible stuff people can do, let's look at the intangibles. I'm going to take you back to a book that came out in 2010 that has just some great lessons that I really like about the intangible things that managers can work on. It's called, ironically, The Intangibles of Leadership by Richard Davis. But it's got a nice segue into the things that we often think about but don't really have names for and don't explicitly work on. I'm going to pick just 5 of the 10 that he has in the book and kind of give you my own small spin on them. But here are some things that we say leaders need to work on. As we talk through them, I think you're going to see that these are also lessons that come from art and from athletics as well. And the first is grit, resilience. It's the ability to bounce back when things don't go the way you want them to. If you're not familiar with this concept, I'm going to highly recommend Angela Duckworth's TED Talk on resilience. It's fabulous. But the idea of developing yourself into someone who can bounce back and who can re-engage when things go wrong is absolutely critical to your success as a leader, because your team learns that from you. If you're not freaked out by an obstacle, they're not freaked out by an obstacle. And when you show grit, well, your team gets grittier. They do a better job of embracing things that are hard and working through them. The second is self-awareness. Now, we know this is a hallmark of emotional intelligence. We know it's important to the way that we do work. But we also need to stop and think about the blind spots that we might have as a result of being managers. One of the things that happens when you move up through an organization is there's fewer people above you to give you feedback. And so oftentimes we grow as leaders, but we don't find ourselves having a lot of awareness of the ways in which that's happening. We also may not be aware of the ways that we're reacting to people, both verbally and non-verbally. So are you showing people that you're genuinely excited when they bring you a report, or are you working on your computer or your phone and frankly a little bored? The kind of self-awareness that we're talking about here basically says you need to understand what makes you tick, what makes you mad, and what kinds of things are really important to you in terms of the way you treat people. And then to monitor your behavior to make sure that you can manage all of those aspects of yourself well. If you're in doubt, ask somebody to help you, because often it's the blind spots that we really don't see that when we work through, we can get a lot better. Third is resourcefulness. It's finding a way to make things happen. And when we want to be more resourceful, we seek challenging situations. We seek ways that we can go into a really tough place and work our way through it. It's really popular right now for leaders to take their teams to escape rooms. And I'm a big fan, because that whole experience tells the team we together can be resourceful. So anything that leads your team to learn to lean on each other as they solve problems is absolutely a good measure here of what you can do to get better as a leader and make your team more resourceful. You may have also heard of the book called Leaders Eat Last. And it comes down to this notion that as a leader, you're not necessarily pulling people, you're pushing them. You're more behind them, supporting them. This notion of self-sacrificing love may seem a little romantic and like maybe I wrote this too close to Valentine's Day. But what we're talking about here is a real genuine concern for the people around you, a genuine care for the people that you're leading. People respond to genuine affection more so than almost anything else. When we talk about the power that people have as leaders, one of the biggest ones is likability. Does someone like me and want to be with me? And if the answer is yes, then they will do more and sacrifice more for the leader. How do you get that liking? Give it to someone first. It turns out that truly being interested in your team, truly wanting to know them as people, truly caring about them as individuals makes a difference. And the bonds that you can form there become really important to your success as a leader and the success of your team. So slow down. Get to know your team a little better. That can make a big difference in the way that you as a leader succeed. And then finally, know your purpose. Understand your why. Why do you get out of bed in the morning? What is your why? What motivates you? But then go a little bit bigger. What's your team's why? Who relies on you? What are the most important things that you do as a group of people within your company? What are the big goals that you need to be responsible for? What's the most important thing that your company does? Have you looked at your mission statement lately? Do you know why your organization exists and how you contribute to that mission? Those are the things that can not only keep you focused on moving forward in a productive way, but they also allow you to stop and reflect on yourself as a leader and to make sure that you are actually aligned with the things that your organization truly stands for. Well, I hope I've given you some insight into how to become a virtuoso leader and maybe given you some things from sports and from music that can make that process a little bit easier. I'm assuming we've got questions because I know we are at the point where those are available. So tell me what we got. Who wants to know what?
Thank you, Dr. Gorner. This has been terrific. You haven't heard my voice yet. This is Kim Goad with the Kelly Executive Education Office, or as we like to say, the voice of God, because you haven't seen my. I've taken on that moniker.
I like that.
I like that. As Dr. Gorner said, this is the time to enter questions in the chat box if you have them. And I've got one, and I just realized that when we talk about giving feedback, I already messed up and said this has been terrific. I didn't do it. So, you didn't do a lot of bouncing because you're sitting down. So
exactly right. Why do you think I'm sitting? Yeah.
As a manager, as I've had roles in the past when I've managed folks, I think that I got better at giving feedback. I think it was tough for me to receive it or maybe to make space for them to give it to me. So can you speak a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Receiving feedback is arguably one of the hardest things that we do. Unfortunately, most of us have a little bit of imposter syndrome in us or have a little bit of insecurity about the ways that we're doing things. And so it's tempting when we hear somebody say, oh, this could be better, to have a little bit of a freak out moment and say, everything I do is awful. And so the key is to do two things. The first is to take it in context. Recognize what it is about this individual that might be prompting them to give you that feedback. So a lot of times I'll get conflicting statements from students, for example, and some will say, I love your passion, I love your energy, and other people will say, you talk too fast. Yep, when I get excited, I talk too fast. And so my job is to take all of that into stride. And I know that when I get excited, I speed up talking. Am I going to stop getting excited? No. But I am then going to be conscious of the fact that I need to put a little bit of a lid on it, breathe a little more deeply, and bring it down. So feedback doesn't mean that I'm going to change everything about my approach. It just means that I'm going to tweak it here and there. And I think that's where people really get off the rails about feedback, is they think that they're supposed to completely change their wardrobe, like going into what was that show, What Not to Wear, where they would come in and take everything out of your closet and tell you it was all awful and then, make you something different because what you were before was so bad. And that is not what we're talking about here. And I think that we need to look at feedback as more calibration than people kind of coming back and slamming at us. It's really a matter of perspective.
Yeah, good. Take some pressure off too. So I like the idea of just being able to tweak it and not changing everything about myself. We have a good question here from an alum. While a lot of leadership opportunities concern someone older leading younger individuals, do you have any tips / advice for young individuals leading people also their age or even older than themselves?
Well, I won't do the shameless plug that I should do for the executive education course on leadership for millennials. I guess I just did. But yes, in fact, there are a number of things that we can ask folks to do. The first is to actually own their leadership role. Understand why they are the leader, what it is they bring to the table, and more importantly, how the team as a whole fits together. I think a lot of folks see age and seniority and think skill. And rather than having that all be together, I would argue that age and seniority are more knowledge, perhaps, than skill. So you don't need to be intimidated by the knowledge your people bring to the table, but instead step back a little bit and say, why is this team together? What is it that we do? And how do each of us contribute? You as the leader and the folks that are working for you. Then, to the best of your ability, express that. Tell people what you appreciate about them, why you appreciate them being a part of the team. The other thing that I think younger managers sometimes do is they don't really talk about the ways that they are going to manage folks. They just sort of jump in and assume that everybody has the same vision of what a manager is. So if you are someone who works remotely, be upfront about that. Tell people how to get in touch with you. If you communicate with technology that the older workers don't always use, either teach them how or step back and give them some other alternatives in terms of how to get in touch with you. But I think all leaders, regardless of their age, have to stop the assumption that everybody else thinks just like they do and everyone else knows what they know. And so the idea that you can take your team and really try to understand all of the pieces of it becomes, I think, really central to being an effective leader of people who are older than you. The other thing is to really have someone talk about generational differences. And that, just knowing what some of those differences are like can make a real good impact on what the team is able to do. So understanding, for example, that when someone from Generation Z starts to ask why we're doing something, it's not a pushback. It's not a criticism. A lot of millennials will take that as, well, if you're asking why, that must mean that you disagree. No, it's really just a pragmatic individual who really likes to understand what's going on, and so I'm just going to ask why. So the notion that if we talk about some of those personality differences, generational differences, etc., and really try to understand those, we can work forward. One last tip. find other ways that your team can talk to one another besides age. So think about a Myers-Briggs, think about StrengthsFinder, think about some way that you can think of your team as something other than their age. And so the more that you can find that you have in common or kind of differences that come through that, I think the easier you'll find that process. It's really a matter of not letting age be something that gets in the way of your communication.
That's really good. I think this is, it sounds like there are we've got great questions coming in,
Cool.
and another one that has to do with interestingly, about the generational differences. So I don't know that you would add anything else to this with this question, but as a leader, do we need to adapt to our subordinates or work with them on adapting to us and our vision? How do you create the collaborative two-way street?
The last part of that question absolutely said it. What you want to do is basically sit down and say, here's how I am as a manager. How are you as a subordinate? And have the conversation about how that connection happens. One of the things we forget to do very often is tell people how to manage up to us. And so how do you like to be communicated with? When do you want people to check in with you? And at that point, you've opened up a dialogue where someone can say, okay, I get that you want to talk to me every day, but that sounds like overkill and a little bit like micromanagement. Maybe we can step back and do something that'll be every other day or twice a week so that we can really talk that through. But remember that self-awareness piece. I contend that a lot of leaders don't know what their style is and probably couldn't answer, how do I like to be communicated with? How do I like to get updates? So stop and step back and think about what really works best for you. And then when you model being able to communicate that, people can come back and use what you just taught them how to do to give you some feedback that'll allow you to meet in the middle.
That's perfect, and leads into the next question,
Good.
actually, about feedback. As a lot of our alumni are still in the Midwest, what are some tricks you found to eliciting specific feedback in a Midwestern nice culture?
We are nice, aren't we? Oh,
that tends to shy away from being direct?
One of the things that you can do is talk about what Marshall Goldberg calls feed forward. And that tends to kind of get people out of the mindset that they're trying to criticize what you did in the past. The Midwest nice tends to be, okay, that's what happened. We're not going to talk about it if it wasn't good. And so rather than asking people for help about what happened in the past, ask them what you should do differently in the future. If I'm going to do this again, what should I consider? Coach me, help me do this better. And that becomes a different kind of conversation because, again, that Midwest nice is, well, we want to help. And so when we ask people for coaching or assistance or input or insight, that's a lot different than asking them for feedback. And I think that feedback word sometimes gets people pretty defensive, but when we can ask people to coach us or help us, folks will step up in our culture and definitely do that.
Great. There's one on delegation. Professor Gorner, as someone who is not good with delegation, I was wondering if you can give some tips on learning how to delegate.
It's hard. It's really hard. Start small and really come to the idea that it's got to be something where you're going to have to give up your identity around it. You're going to have to give up what it looks like. And you're going to have to basically say, this isn't going to be mine anymore. That's hard. So first is figure out the purpose of what it is that you're delegating. Who's the audience? Who are the internal or external customers for it? And what is it really important that it have? And communicate that to the individual. Talk to them then about how they might approach it and ask them to think about a procedure or a process. You can provide some feedback, but I think the trap people fall into is trying to give someone a recipe for how to make this work. And that's where things really fall apart. A, they may not have the resources that you do. B, they may not know the techniques that you do. And so your job then is to say, what do you think you do? And help them figure out for themselves what their approach to it's going to be. If you're twitching at the thought of delegation, I'm going to ask you to just kind of practice on some really small levels. If you have children, let them fold their own clothes. If you are somebody who works out in your yard a lot and really needs everything to be precise, ask somebody else if they'll trim the lawn for you. The idea that you need to understand that you don't have to be responsible for perfection in everything is really kind of central to the idea of delegating. So a lot of it's just a mind shift that says, okay, it's not going to happen that way. One last caveat. the big thing on the wall of my office, the thing that is the biggest when you walk in the door, is actually a quote from President Truman. And it says, "It's amazing what you can do if you don't care who gets the credit." So ask yourself if part of that delegation isn't needing the recognition that goes with that, goes with that task or whatever it is, and gift that to somebody. It's not easy, but if you really don't care who gets the credit, some really cool stuff can happen.
That makes me think of I liked your case study about the rowing team. And I hear this all the time as we're talking to clients that they hire for fit. We hear that all the time, cultural fit. But they all also have this, it's seemingly as a at odds objective with hiring for diversity as well. How do you reconcile the two?
When we talk about hiring for fit, we're not talking about people who look alike, sound alike, and have all of the same skills. We're talking about people who can collectively bring things to the table that help everybody grow. And so one of the things that I love, when an organization says I hire for fit, one of the first things I ask is, fit for what? And if you're saying you're going to hire people who agree with everything that we already do, I'm getting really nervous. So my challenge to those folks who say we hire for fit is, have you looked really hard at the cultural values that you have? And are you really hiring people who will question? Are you really hiring people who will force you to think in another way? Because we sometimes can use that fit thing as an excuse for not bringing in people who will shake up the way that people think. And so fundamentally, have you brought new perspective? Have you brought in a different way of looking at the world? Have you brought in people who have different ways of communicating? See, they may not appear to fit on the surface, but here's what all the research says. We get past that surface level stuff pretty quick. If you find people who connect with the values of your organization at a really fundamental level, you can have a lot of diversity of thought around that and then how those values are enacted. So if you're going to hire for fit, hire for deep level fit and really try to look for that cultural value mesh.
You talked about some good resources in your talk. One of the alums is also asking, are there other resources, books, articles that you could recommend and how they develop their own leadership?
Oh my goodness, there are. And I'm just having a brainstorm here, so I'm looking over at my folks in the Alumni Association as we put this website together. I know that one of the things that they're going to do is take this and the subsequent webinars and put them together on a website that we can access. I bet we could put a resource page in there too. I just got a big nod and a sure. We can do that. So the idea that I and my colleagues can post a favorite book or give you some of that insight, always glad to do it, always.
Wonderful. Well, that's all the questions we have here, and we promised that this would be about 45 minutes.
We are there.
Yeah. This has been terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. Gorner. Again, I use terrific, so offline I'll tell you some specifics that I loved about it.
I appreciate that.
I also wanted to thank all of you. We had such a great turnout. Thank you for to all the participants who were here, and also to my friend and colleague, Allison DeWitt with the Alumni Association for partnering with Kelly Executive Education to offer these. If we could, thank you. If you've enjoyed this, and we hope you have, please mark your calendars. We're going to be doing these every other month, and so the next one is on April 7th on the power of presence with Professor Tatiana Kolavu, and then June 11 with Professor Scott Shackelford in securing the Internet of Things. And then one last thing, wanted to let you know that Kelly Executive Education offers a lot. If you've enjoyed hearing and want to hear more on the kinds of topics that Dr. Gorner talked about, like delegation and giving feedback, and a lot of other things that she delivers topics on, including negotiation and unconscious bias and a whole host of things. We offer, and proud to partner with Dr. Gorner and a number of just outstanding Kelly faculty to deliver programs for individuals in the form of certificates that are delivered in residence or online, and you can find that on our website. And if you're also interested in perhaps bringing some of these topics to your organization, we also deliver custom programs to companies. So reach out to me if you'd like to talk more about that. And again, thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day.